Chapter 3. 3 years later. It was late in the evening in Carver. The light had just faded from the sky when a solitary traveller entered the town. Although it was a warm summer night, he was cloaked, and his face was hidden under a hood. Slung across his back was a quiver bristling with atlatl darts about 5 feet in length each. At his side he carried a worn bedroll bundle of provisions. He scanned the buildings along the street as he walked, looking for one in particular, but did not pause for directions from the wary folk who watched as he passed. He stopped at last at the Wild Rose Tavern. Pushing open the door, he blinked in the sudden light. The owner was a stout fellow in a clean apron, clearing a table. He regarded the newcomer with a rushed glance, and then looked again for a longer inspection. His practised smile faltered perceptibly. "Welcome. Come in. What can I do for you?" he asked, making his way toward the door. Some of the clientele looked up to see who had entered. The establishment was not large and only half full. The stranger reached into his bedroll and pulled out a curiously carved flute. "A song for supper?" He had made an effort to speak deliberately, but he sensed a lilting accent creeping into his words and winced inwardly. The owner looked him up and down, seeming to note his dark face, worn boots, patched cloak, and bundle of darts on his back. Finally he nodded. "Leave your weapons behind the counter. I'll not cheat you out of supper if you're any good. If you're not, I'll ask you to leave. Clear?" The stranger nodded. The owner extended his hand. "Name's Viri, and you are—" "Nijat." He shook his hand and bowed slightly, but didn't pull his hood back. There was an awkward pause as Viri's eyes lingered on his unearthly, vibrant blue eyes. Nijat had wished 1,000 times there were a way to hide his eyes without blinding himself, but had yet to find it. For a person who wished not to be remembered, they were a cursed nuisance. Viri shrugged after a moment and gestured to an area tucked behind the bar. "Put your things back here, lad. I'll be sure no one touches them." Nijat slipped his quiver off and leaned it against the back of the counter. That, with his bedding bundle, a large dagger, and atlatl were all he had. He took his flute in hand and moved near the hearth, still wearing his hood and cloak. Without any preamble, he laid the flute to his lips and began a sweetly haunting tune. The chatter around the tavern slowly quieted as the customers listened with interest to the tune and observed the strange person who played it. As the song ended, there was a pause, and then a carpenter in the corner called out, "Do you know Mirena's Love?" Nijat nodded and started into the livelier folk melody. Once finished, another request was called out, and he began again. When the final notes of the 6th tune faded into silence, Viri approached with a plate of food and a mug of coffee. There, friends. Let the lad catch his breath for a minute, and then we'll have another tune." He patted Nijat on the shoulder. "Eat up, boy." Nijat nodded and pulled his chair up next to the place set for him, but paused with the first forkful suspended in the air. "Sir, a word with you?" Viri's expression showed that Nijat's lilting accent had not escaped his notice. A look of suspicion wrinkled his brow before it was quickly smoothed away. "Yes?" "Might Inessa of Carver be known to you?" Viri's eyes narrowed, then he tilted his head back in a show of consideration. "Inessa, you say? Not sure I recall. A lot of people pass through here." Nijat simply nodded and dug into the food in front of him. Viri's expression had told him what he needed to know. After eating, he played several more tunes, then put away his flute, retrieved his things, and left. 2 weeks later, He approached the tavern again, with the same offer of music for food. He played, ate his food, and left. 2 weeks later, he appeared again, and again 2 weeks after that. Viri began to expect him on those nights, and regulars began inviting people to hear the strange music the foreign man played. 2 months passed with this arrangement until Nijat plodded in one rainy night with water streaming from his cloak and hood. He bent to stow his things behind the counter, then stopped. A woman was at the bar, swishing a mug of ale, pretending not to listen to the conversation beside her. She was dressed in the same fashion that he remembered, and wore the same 2 braids framing her face, clan honour braids. This must be her. She looked up and met his gaze at that moment, as if sensing his stare. Her eyebrows lifted a little, and she leaned back, crossing her arms. Her sharp eyes raked over him, making him self-conscious of the rainwater dripping from his tattered clothes. When her eyes returned at last to meet his, she pursed her lips and tipped her head with a quizzical air. Rising, she sauntered across the room to him. "I heard you were looking for me," she said bluntly. "Do you speak Azovian or Western dialect?" "Azovian," he answered, his mouth gone a bit dry. She nodded and beckoned to him to follow her, putting a coin on the counter as she passed. "Viri, we'll take the corner table. Supper and coffee for this one, he's soaked through." She jerked her head toward the table. "Come on." Nijat followed, but said nothing, feeling the stares of the other customers on his back. He took off his quiver and leaned it against the wall, then sat down and wiped his wet face on his slightly less wet cloak hem. "Nijat, at your service." He inclined his head politely. The talk at nearby tables began again. Her eyes widened as he spoke. "That accent!" Reaching across the table, she pushed back his hood, revealing his long curly black hair shot through with white on the right side. Deep in the sodden curls, flickers of elven light flashed dully in the yellow lamplight of the tavern. He flinched. "Don't!" He yanked the hood back up, shooting furtive glances in the direction of the other patrons. No one had noticed. He let his breath out slowly and turned back to Inessa. Realization was written on Inessa's face. She leaned towards him, elbows on the table, cautious and fascinated in equal measure. Of course, she remembered. How could she forget someone as strange as him? "So," breathed Inessa, lowering her voice, "you survived. I thought for a certainty you were dead. I rode to search for you the next day, but couldn't find you anywhere. Only a dead horse at the bottom of a cliff. Yours, I believed. And great tracks of lions all around where you had been. It's almost impossible. Lions so far north? Did your pursuers bring them just to eat you?" Nijat smiled slightly and shrugged. "I don't know, but I saw no lions that night. A friend came for me after you left. It was a close thing." "You should have seen how angry my client was at the misuse of her horse to go looking for you." He chuckled. "I can imagine. I heard some of her ragging from the bushes while you were travelling." Inessa's eyes narrowed. "Were you the one following us?" "I was just trying to hide my trail with yours." "Didn't seem to work. Whatever was following you seemed to have quite a sting." He dropped his eyes. "No, it didn't work." He shivered and touched his shoulder, feeling the shadow of the icy wound. There was a small pause as Inessa looked at him as if waiting for him to continue, but he didn't. He had no desire to relive that night. She leaned back and crossed her arms. "So, did you come to reminisce with me?" He looked up, apprehension tightening his chest. here it was, time to ask for what he had come to learn. Under his breath he offered a prayer to the elven gods as he leaned forward. "Where's the child?" "I brought her to the Brannaden clan. She's still there." "Still where?" Nijat asked, raising an eyebrow. Inessa gestured at the air. "With them." Nijat sighed. "Look, maybe to an Azovian who grew up among the nomad clans, it's a simple thing to find a particular clan and ask for a particular person. But for anyone else—" He pulled his cloak away from his arm to reveal the freshly healed pink scar of a wound just below his elbow. "The Brannaden clan stabbed you?" "Well, I don't know which clan, but one of them did." Inessa leaned back and looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Who told you I'm an Azovian originally? Why were you prying?" Nijat swallowed. This conversation was not going the way he had hoped, but perhaps honesty would make a show of good faith to this woman. "I was worried about who I had left her with, although I didn't have much choice at the time. I paid some money to your rival wayfinders to tell me the worst there was about you. They could tell me that you had grown up adopted into the clans and were still a bit wild from it. That, and you are a woman conducting business out of a tavern, which is apparently unseemly according to them. All in all, if that was the worst they had, it was pretty good." Inessa shrugged, her expression still unreadable. Nijat grew uncomfortable. "Look, I need your help. I need to find that child." "Why?" He hesitated, wondering how to answer the question. "Is she yours?" He dropped his eyes. "She's my sister." "Oh." There was a flicker of compassion in her expression. He looked around to see if anyone was listening, then leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "I nearly died that night, and it was a long recovery. Then, when I finally was well enough, I was afraid to lead them back to her. I thought it was safer for her if I stayed away." He looked down and fidgeted with the edge of his cloak, then lifted his eyes again. "But I haven't been followed in a year now, and I can't wander forever. I just want to see that she's well and she's happy. And I don't want her to forget her family." Viri came at that moment and set dinner in front of Nijat. But he barely noticed and picked up again as soon as Viri moved away. "She probably already has forgotten, I suppose." Inessa shrugged. "Who knows?" She picked up the fork and handed it to Nijat. "Eat." He took it and half-heartedly put a bite in his mouth. "So, what do you say?" he asked, politely covering his mouth with his hand. She blew her breath out slowly and leaned back to think. "It's a long trip, and fairly dangerous for just two people alone, especially with—" She gestured to his hair. "I don't know who was after you, but I don't want to be caught up in anything crazy." Nijat reached into the folds of his cloak and withdrew a money pouch. "You work for hire, don't you?" "Let me hire you." "I'm not cheap." "I didn't say you were," he answered. He put 30 gold marders in her hand and closed her fist around them. "If that's what it took to get you out to the Brecca last time, can't it get you there again?" Inessa looked at the money and then back at him with suspicion in her eyes. "Where did you get this?" It's the money I was paid to assassinate you." His eyes twinkled with humour. Inessa glared at him. "Liar." "You sure?" One corner of his mouth pulled up into a half-smile. "I've done my best to live a relatively uneventful life. No one wants me dead. Look, it's my money. Are you in?" Inessa sighed and offered her hand for him to shake. "Fine. We leave tomorrow." Nijat shook his head and stood up without taking her hand. "We leave now. Come on." She looked at him and raised her eyebrow. "I decide that, not you. We can leave tonight, but I need to collect my travel gear. Are we taking a pack horse?" "No pack horse." He shoved the rest of the meat from his plate in his mouth and tucked the bread in his bedroll for later. "Can we meet on the West Road, where it runs beside the burial mound, in 2 hours?" She nodded slowly. "Fine." "It's settled then." Looking back, he smiled with one corner of his mouth. "See you there."